So, okay, January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues, as promised, as threatened, the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the least well understood documents, key documents of American history. If you think that Lincoln freed all the slaves with a stroke of his pen, no, he did not. The Emancipation Proclamation, there were 4 million slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to the border states because they're in the Union. This is directed at the Confederacy. There are 4 border states with 500,000 slaves. They are not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. Moreover, Lincoln exempts certain parts of the South, these hatched areas from Virginia down. That's where the Emancipation Proclamation applies. It does not apply to Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. It does not apply to West Virginia, which is coming in as a free state soon. It does not apply to Tennessee. Lincoln exempts Tennessee at the request of military governor Andrew Johnson. After capturing Nashville, a pro-union government had set up, and Lincoln exempts Tennessee. He exempts southern Louisiana down here. He exempts a few counties in eastern Virginia. The argument there is areas under Union control no longer are in rebellion, and this is an act against the rebellion. So there are little areas, if you add them up, there may be another couple of 100,000 slaves in areas exempted in the South. So all told, about 750,000 slaves are not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. But by the same token, something like 3.2 million are declared free on January 1st, 1863. This is the largest emancipation in world history on one day. Never before or since had so many slaves been declared free at one moment. Now, of course, there were those who said, well, it doesn't mean anything because you're only declaring them free in areas where it cannot be enforced, right? The London Times said this is like a papal bull, a papal proclamation against a comet. Some pope long ago had issued a proclamation telling a comet to go away, and it didn't. In other words, it's outside of your jurisdiction. This is outside the jurisdiction. So yes, on the day it was issued, it did not free many slaves. However, it's not fair to say, as you sometimes read, that it didn't free anybody. For example, it applied to the Sea Islands, where the Union Army was in control, but Lincoln did not exempt them. So those slaves, which is 10, 20,000 at least, were free as of January 1st. And there were other areas of eastern Arkansas, etc. So Lincoln carefully decided which areas he wanted to exempt and which he didn't. A couple of points in relation to this. One is, whatever the limits, this was, as they called it, a day of jubilee among African Americans all over the country. Black people, whether in the South, if they could, certainly in Union-occupied South, in the North, gathered in churches and other meetings to kind of celebrate the day of jubilee, the day of emancipation. Where they could, they had parades, processions, that sort of thing. Why? Why? If this didn't mean anything, why? Because they understood that if slavery dies in Mississippi or in South Carolina, it's not going to survive very long in Kentucky and Tennessee. That this is the death knell of slavery. It is not the end of slavery. No, slavery doesn't end. Interestingly enough, the proclamation frees individuals, right? It frees people. It does not abolish the institution of slavery. The laws of slavery remain on the books, right? It frees slaves. But to get rid of slavery, you need either to repeal those laws or eventually to have a constitutional amendment. This is why the 13th Amendment will become necessary, as we will see, to put into the Constitution the abrogation of all those laws which establish and protect the institution of slavery. So it is a step, it is a step, it is the key step, it is a step. It is not the end of the question of slavery. What gives the president the right to declare 3.2 million people free? Well, Lincoln says very clearly, this is under the war power of the Constitution. As commander-in-chief, he is issuing it as commander-in-chief of the army, okay? That's where the authority comes from. It is a military measure. If you read it, you may be disappointed. It is boring. Military orders are boring. It does not have ringing language like it doesn't have immortal language like the Declaration of Independence about the rights of mankind, right? No, there's nothing like that. Only at the very end, the very last minute in the cabinet, Chase says to Lincoln, you should put something moral in here. So Lincoln, the very last sentence, you will see, he says, this act, and I don't have the exact words, issued under military necessity and believed to be an act of justice. Believed to be an act of justice. That's the only moral sentiment in the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, among other things, Lincoln is a lawyer and a very good lawyer. And he is worried that if you base it on anything other than military necessity, it will not stand up in court. Now, how important that factor was, I don't know. Some people said, oh, he's afraid the Supreme Court will declare it unconstitutional. Frankly, I don't believe it. The Supreme Court would have been lunatic to declare the Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional, especially with Chief Justice Taney still, until he dies at the end of 1864, still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. If they had done that, Congress would have just abolished the Supreme Court, which it can under the Constitution, and just create another Supreme Court. That would be perfectly constitutional. But I think Lincoln didn't want long litigation about this in state courts and federal courts. So he thought the war power was the strongest constitutional grounding for this measure. Being a military act, which is what it was, to help win the war, it requires Union victory to be implemented. In other words, it makes the Union Army an agent of emancipation. Wherever the Union Army goes now, part of its task is to protect the freedom of these people that Lincoln has declared to be free.